Good afternoon or good evening, depending on whether the sun has set yet where you are. I am Ruth Langer. I'm the interim director of Boston College's Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and I'd like to welcome you to our John Paul II annual lecture. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Center's website probably sometime next week. Attendees are welcome to submit questions through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And together with our behind-the-scenes team, to whom our gratitude is due, Camille Markey, the Center's Associate Director, and Sam Jai, my graduate student and also able tech assistant, I will then communicate your questions to our speaker after the lecture. Several years ago, we established this annual lectureship named for Pope St. John Paul II, the Pope who single-handedly took the teachings of the Second Vatican Council about Jews and Judaism and transformed them from words on paper, only beginning to be implemented, into a matter of church priority. As a consequence, Catholic and with it Christian thinking more broadly has begun a long process of addressing the complexities about its formal and informal teachings about Jews. Our lecture today has been a significant contributor to this process as a participant in dialogue herself and as an educator par excellence. Mary Boyes is the Skinner and McAlpin Professor of Practical Theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, as well as its former academic vice president and dean. Her graduate degrees in religion and education are from a joint program between Union and Columbia University, but she began her teaching career here at Boston College before returning to Union in 1995. Mary Boyes is the author of 6 books, editor of 3 more, and several of these I regularly assign in courses, as she is one of the leading American Catholic voices in Christian-Jewish dialogue. Mary Boyes is a vowed member of the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, a congregation of Roman Catholic women. It has been a real privilege and pleasure to count Mary as a friend and colleague for many years, to learn from her and with her. Although we regrettably will not be able to sit down to dinner together after her lecture, I'm sure that we will all end up with much to digest. And we look forward, Mary, to learning from you today as you bring your accumulated experience in dialogue to your talking, walking you make the road, discerning the way in Jewish-Christian relations today.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It does make me very sad that we are not in physical presence with one another. I so miss my colleagues, my friends, especially people I've worked with in the interreligious realm. But I am grateful that we can at least be together in this medium, though I suspect by now all of us are experiencing a serious case of Zoom fatigue. So for those of you who are watching, thank you for persevering. I begin with a poem from which I have taken my title. It's by Antonio Machado. Walker, your footsteps are the road and nothing more. Walker, there is no road. The road is made by walking. Walking, you make the road. And turning to look behind, you see the path you never again will step upon. Walker, there is no road, only foam trails on the sea. We live in an era of unprecedented collaboration and scholarly exchange between Jews and Christians, and certainly Ruth has been an important part of that. And I'd like to acknowledge the role that the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College plays, not only by sponsoring programs, by the various videos that they are making, not only by the journal that they publish, but simply by their creativity and their generosity. So I'm just very grateful, and not only to Ruth, but also to the Director Emeritus James Bernauer of the Society of Jesus. So in the past 60 years or so, many people, archaeologists, biblical scholars, historians, and theologians, including liturgists, I might say, with the nod to Ruth's specialty, have contributed immensely significant knowledge about the religious traditions in the Mediterranean world of antiquity. And at the same time, they have contributed more sophisticated categories and concepts in the study of religion more generally, including problematizing the term religion in the period of antiquity. And yet all this wonderful knowledge lies in territory beyond the ken of most Christians. We are called, I believe, to be walkers or wayfarers, as in some translations, making a road to provide entree into what is foreign territory for many Christians. A story from the time when we actually could assemble in public together. I was at church, half listening to the homily, when the homilist startled me awake, asserting with force, "Jesus founded a new religion." And then he repeated it for emphasis. "Jesus founded a new religion." I surveyed my parishioners, my fellow parishioners. They didn't seem bothered in the least. No alarm bells were sounding in the church. Later, he and I communicated, and I offered him and provided him with various resources. I suspect in retrospect that those books and articles have not proven helpful to him because they don't correspond to the template about Judaism and its relationship to Christianity that he assimilated long ago. And it strikes me that that view that Jesus is the founder of Christianity is a conviction shared by most Christians in the world. And if Jesus didn't found Christianity, then it was Paul. So this evening, I'd like to speak in three ways. I'd like to talk about the work of widening and extending the road. I will offer in the second part 7 conceptual gateways in process. And third, with a nod to the approaching Lunar New Year in the year of the ox, a Chinese proverb that only on the muddy road can we leave deep footprints. So part 1. The notion that Jesus founded Christianity houses an array of anachronisms, assumptions, and arguments. I confess that I was tempted by a little frilly note of irony here. This is from a website, the photo, 10 top reasons the Catholic Church is the one true church founded by Jesus Christ. This is not something I believe, but this is an indication of the kind of thing that is available for people who are sincerely looking to use the internet to deepen their own understanding of Christianity. Unfortunately, much of what is out there is grossly inadequate. So the problem is that these assumptions and anachronisms and arguments are in a way at the bottom or at the foundation of some of the anti-Judaism that we have been dealing with for many years. So here are some 5 anachronisms and assumptions and arguments that come from the notion that Jesus founded Christianity. First of all, it assumes that the religion, i.e. Judaism, Jesus came from was inadequate, and thus there's a need for a new religion. And because Jesus was the founder, the disciples of the first generations were Christians. Think how often in hearing sermons, the people of the early church, Peter, James, and John, Mary of Magdalene, Martha, and Mary, are all immediately included in the term Christians. A third problem is the assumption that the new religion, Christianity, is a superior one. It supersedes the previous one. Judaism and Christianity are symmetrical. They're both religions, which fails to recognize that Judaism is not simply a religious tradition, but a people. And this misunderstanding of Judaism is a real problem for Christianity. More on that later. And then finally, I think that at heart, this notion of Jesus as the founder of Christianity is at least a suggestion that the relationship between Jews and Christians has just always been contentious, if not adversarial. And in fact, so too today are Judaism and Christianity, both in a position of competition or in a problematic relationship. Now, add to these anachronisms, assumptions, and arguments some of the problematic New Testament texts, such as those that accuse Jews of being responsible for the death of Jesus. You can see how anti-Jewish perspectives developed, and also why they must be rejected. Ignorance is dangerous, and ignorance in the religious sphere is especially so, as history bears witness. Christians deserve to have a more adequate understanding of the context that shaped the early generations of followers of Jesus and that were crucial to the emergence of the church. How we frame the emergence of Christianity in relationship to Judaism sets the stage for how we understand that relationship today, and not only the relationship to Judaism, but to other religious traditions as well. So tonight, I'm calling this a thesis. It's probably more like a rationale for the project that I'm working with right now. Christians, I believe, need a comprehensive and comprehensible, concise and compelling synthesis of the emergence and development of Christianity in relationship to Judaism, characterized by being based on sound scholarship, that is, a search for truth, characterized by a nourishment of mind and spirit, that is, it both provides people with good sound knowledge, but also is personally and spiritually enriching. And finally, that probes implications for living as Christians in a religiously pluralistic world. I will, with a note of irony, say just a word now about the adjective concise. I've written several books of some length. I do not in any way repent of that. They were wonderful intellectual projects for me. But I want this book to be much shorter because I don't think that the people, the audience for whom I am writing, are people who want to read 350-page books. So the challenge is to build a very nuanced narrative, but with attention to making it concise. So it's this daunting task of creating a synthesis that's compelling, that's comprehensive, that's understandable and concise, that requires us to make the road by walking. We don't really have such a vade mecum. Of course, unlike the Machado verse that there is no road, a road already exists, a road of wonderful scholarship. But this road needs to be widened and extended. And walking, we will widen and extend the road. So I'm now about to go to part 2, the conceptual gateways, in which I'm proposing an initial framework for the account. I do not claim in this lecture that I am presenting original scholarship. Rather, what I'm doing is suggesting some concepts that constitute a sort of survey of the territory on which we might extend and widen our road. The number 7 is simply a way of organizing ideas. They are not, I cannot say that these are the final 7 or that the end product will be 7. It's a sort of a stratagem for this lecture. So I will say a little bit about each of these 7 claims, their arguments. Some I will not speak as much to, partly because where my research has been, but I will speak to all 7. And I would especially be interested in feedback on this lecture. If you have any further ideas, you see a serious omission, please, by all means, just shoot me an email. I played with this first claim a little bit. It seems a little strange to say this, but that we need to make Jesus the Jew come to life. It is clear, I think, to people in the churches that Jesus is Jewish, but it doesn't have any content to it. It's been more declared than elaborated on or explained. And in order to do this, we need to retrieve Jesus before Christianity so as to situate Jesus and Paul in the context of Second Temple Jewish life, an era when, in a sense, what you can say is that we have Jews before Judaism. So let me just explain this a little bit. There are several claims that follow from this. The first is the need to provide true information about the world of Jewish life in the nearly 600-year period known as the Second Temple, that is from 516 BCE to the year 70 when the Romans destroyed the temple in the city of Jerusalem. This is the context of the Jewish Jesus. One way of talking about this is to use the term common Judaism. That is, this is the Judaism of the people and the priests. This is the constellation of practices and beliefs regarding God, the land, the people, and Shabbat. Within that, there was an enormous variety of opinions. There was a lot of disagreement. We never, so often what we hear in the church about Judaism is just outright wrong or oversimplified. We must resist the temptation to make even common Judaism homogeneous. In fact, at the end of the book that they've edited on common Judaism, McCready and Reinhardt's write, in the Second Temple period, Jewish life, and here I'm quoting, was in fact an untidy, complex, and contradictory reality that fused widespread adherence to a set of beliefs and practices with fierce controversy and contradiction, the tussle for power, and the impulse to exclude others on one basis or another. I think that same sentence could apply to Catholicism today. That is, that there's this contestation that's going on of trying to understand what our tradition is. Over the course of the summer, I read the book by Barbara Meyer, Jesus the Jew in Christian Memory, which is an argument aimed particularly at the audience of systematic theologians. But I want to rehearse some of her claims for the sake of this lecture, because I think they are ones that require a lot of reflection on our part. Jesus, she says, was not someone who could have lived anywhere in any era. To the contrary, Jesus was a Jew with specific practice, narrative, and tradition. He was one who practiced the distinctive daily rituals of Jewish males of his day. He was connected to the structures of time, celebrating festivals, following the practices of common Judaism, knowing and studying the Pentateuch and the prophets. Meyer understands Jesus as a practicing, Torah observant, and halakhically committed Jew. And his disputations with the Pharisees, most famously, reveal him engaging in what is characteristically a Jewish debate about how Torah should be lived out. To remember Jesus as observing Torah, as interpreted in his time, reveals the positive significance of Jewish law that Christian theologians, for the most part, have neglected. I think the most helpful metaphor for me is Paula Fredriksen's metaphor, in which she suggests that we think of Torah as sheet music. The notes were the notes, but Jews played a lot of improv. Negative views of Torah, translated into Greek as nomos, have been a huge problem for the church, and one of the problems is the very translation into the Greek. Better, we should think of Torah as teaching or as instruction. Under this same first claim, we also need to place Paul, who begins his letters in the decades of the 50s, that Paul lived entirely within the ambit of Judaism. In the wonderful phraseology of the late Christopher Stendhal, Paul was called, not converted. His calling was to teach non-Jews or Gentiles what it meant to walk in the way of Christ alongside Jewish Christ followers, but not taking on the practices and rituals of Israel, which belonged to Israel's covenant with God. This is not a new claim. Christopher Stendhal was talking about this in the 1970s, but it's a claim that is awkward, I think, in a church such as mine that celebrates the feast of the conversion of St. Paul on the 25th of January. So we need to make known the Jewish Paul as well as the Jewish Jesus. And then finally, just a brief note here that translation of some New Testament texts tends to reinforce an anachronistic understanding of Christianity, suggesting that institutional separation happened shortly after the death, resurrection of Jesus. For instance, the New Testament often uses the Greek term ecclesia, from which we have the Latin ecclesia, and it's typically translated as church. But that's only one of the ways it can be translated. It's actually synonymous with synagogue, the Greek for synagogue, so that, and both mean assembly or gathering. That is, we don't have Christianity in a church yet. We have gatherings of people who are following the way of Jesus. So that takes me to the second claim, that the followers of the way, that is, those who are the followers of Jesus, we don't yet have institutional Christianity, that and the term the way comes from the Acts of the Apostles, and it seems to me a very powerful way that we can talk about the followers of Jesus without building a Christian church so soon. So they reread the scriptures of Israel, but by the time we have Paul, he comes out of the world of Hellenistic Judaism, and so his scriptures are the scriptures that have been translated into Greek. And they reread these scriptures through the lens of the life and the death and resurrection of Jesus. And by so doing, they preserved Israel's scriptures for the church. But the shadow side of this is that the arguments that they used demeaned Jewish interpretations of their scriptures, and thereby they demeaned Jews. Just a couple of points to elaborate on this. When the early generations of those who followed the way of Jesus gave voice to their convictions, they drew upon their native Jewish culture. That's what formed them. That's the vocabulary they had. Those are the symbols they knew. And so they reread Israel's scriptures while deciphering and discerning new layers of meaning. So it's hardly surprising that we find in the New Testament that mountains are the site for instruction and revelatory moments, that Jesus is symbolized as the Paschal Lamb who has been sacrificed, and that Jesus and Paul argue with other Jews about how one should live the covenantal life. In this regard, I'd like to give a shout out to the new book by Amy Jo Levine and Mark Z. Brettler, The Bible with and Without Jesus. The subtitle says a great deal: How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently. Moreover, the New Testament doesn't speak with one voice. Not only do we have 4 Gospels different from one another, but consider how Paul speaks of himself. In his letter to the Philippians, he speaks of himself as circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. That is a very different Paul than the Paul of the Acts of the Apostles. And in regard to the people Israel, as Rachel Mikva puts it in her new book, Dangerous Ideas, the followers of the way wavered between claiming we are Israel also and we are Israel instead. My third claim is that Judaism and Christianity emerged in coexistence, conversation, competition, and contestation over the course of several centuries. In other words, it is through this coexistence, conversation, etc., that Judaism and Christianity formed each other. That in a sense, by maybe the 5th century, you have something more like Christianity as considered a religion, and it's has official state status and so forth. But so this is the period when there's this mutual formation going on. They both are consolidating identities and so forth. The problem with this is that contestation proved to be the most lasting legacy because it was thoroughly embedded into Christian theology. And yet we know through social history that Jews and Christians lived as neighbors. They took part together in trying to improve their world, their civic responsibilities, and so forth. So it's important that we try to understand the various levels of interaction between Jews and Christians. One of the things that I think is important is that there is a clear difference between what happens when the early interpreters of who shape what it means to be the followers of the way, when the next generation is not connected to Judaism. That is, they have the early church writers, for the most part, coming from the Gentile world, formed in the ways of Greco-Roman argumentation and rhetoric. And much was lost then when in the formation of Christianity, the Jewish ethnic element fell away. So let's think of the writers of the 2nd century, such as Justin Martyr and Tertullian, Irenaeus, as proto-Christians, because we don't yet really have a Christian church. But they weren't part of the Jewish ethnos, and they set a pattern for argumentation. Only in their view did followers of the way correctly interpret Israel's scriptures. And so Israel had become obsolete. There's a wonderful literature around this whole area, and I don't want to fall into the rabbit hole of limiting myself just talking only about this third point. So I will move on. But I want to point out again that despite the Christian rhetoric to the contrary, Jews were flourishing in many communities, and they interacted with their Christian neighbors in varying ways. And one of the things that we can see is that this was very difficult for some church leaders who did not think they wanted to draw very firm boundaries. We can also see it in some of the laws that developed in certain regions that try to separate or segregate Jews and Christians. And these laws only exist because Jews and Christians were interacting on the level of social life. And in a sense, the religious boundaries were quite porous too. Fourth, theological words have consequences. Over time, Christians added a new layer to the template of an adversarial posture toward Judaism in demeaning actions that were in some cases incitements to violence, in which you have the linkage of race and anti-Judaism, and ultimately in the Shoah, acquiescence to genocide. There's a long history here, and this could be a multi-volume work in itself, but I think that there are at least 4 key areas that we need to lift up for people to kind of get the picture of the consequences of the words, consequences when argumentation is taken out of some of its original context. I'm thinking of the Roman ghetto, in which Jews were kept in a small area along the Tiber River from 1555 to 1870. I mean, think of the church putting Jews in ghettos. I'm thinking of, not too long later, Martin Luther calling for the burning of synagogues, of his tract on Jews and their lies. I'm thinking of Immanuel Kant, who has a scheme of race and talks about the need for a euthanasia of Judaism. And I'm thinking about the Shoah. All of these things are realities that are very important for us to know as part of our legacy. I don't think when someone says, as did this priest, Jesus is the founder of Christianity, that they have any idea of the problems that developed out of such claims. Well, doesn't want to go to the next level. Well, okay. I think that what happened is that the adversarial template was so deeply embedded in the church that few people took notice of how profoundly erroneous and immoral it was. For instance, the bishops of the world were asked in the early 1960s to give suggestions for topics and issues that the Second Vatican Council would ultimately discuss. None of the bishops sent in anything related to the Shoah. It took Jews, for the most part, to awaken us to reconsider our tradition of teaching and preaching. And in a particular way, I think the story of Jules Isaac, the French Jewish historian, and his contribution to a 1947 conference, out of which we have the so-called 10 points of Salisbury, and then particularly in his meeting in June 1960 with the 83-year-old Isaac and the 78-year-old Pope John the 23rd, that became the decisive catalyst in placing the church's relationship with Judaism on the agenda of Vatican II. That is a powerful story that we need to tell and retell in our time. And we now have some much more detail and scholarship about this, thanks to the work of Norman Tobias's book, or thanks to the work of Norman Tobias in his book, The Jewish Conscience of the Church. Sixth, The post Nostra Aetate dialogue groups, the workshops, the conferences, the scholarship challenged the churches to reassess their posture toward Judaism and to reorient their self-understanding. As we get further away from 1965, when Nostra Aetate was promulgated, there are many people who have no idea of that ferment, what was going on in the late 1960s and 70s and even in the 80s. And it's important for people to understand the advances in biblical scholarship that enabled new understandings to develop. I'm not going to linger here because I suspect that many people in this webinar know this quite well. I just want to move to a seventh claim, which doesn't quite fit the same pattern that I've been thinking in. So I was thinking of the line, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod," from James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing. And to pay attention to the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism. They aren't the same, but they are closely related. So maybe it's because it's a week before Lent is to start, that I think because we white Christians bear considerable responsibility for the scourges of racism and anti-Semitism, that the churches should incorporate remembrance of and repentance from these wounds of history into our Lenten observance. We have a service that was done at the Vatican a number of years ago under the leadership of Pope John Paul II that I think is something that we could adapt and bring to our churches. The parish that I've been going to during the pandemic has a pledge for racial justice that we are now reciting each Sunday. It seems to me that we could easily put in a pledge for racial justice and work to counter anti-Semitism. We need only to think about some of the symbols that Christian nationalists brought into the Capitol on the 6th of January. Undoing racism and undoing anti-Judaism both involve letting go of the myth of innocence. Both involve deconstruction that disturbs what Daniel Boyarin calls reciprocally settled identities. Both involve the recognition that racism and anti-Semitism are closely related bigotries for which white Christians bear considerable responsibility. Both involve not simply individual attitudes and actions, but the institutional elements, and in this case, the church's theological claims and policies that constitute systemic anti-Judaism. My final slide, but not quite my final words. I had the privilege of having two Chinese Buddhist nuns in a class in the fall, and it was from them that I learned this wonderful proverb that only on the muddy road can we leave deep footprints. So for those of us in the Northeast who have the mud of snowstorms that have been occurring with regularity, or whether you're looking to warmer regions where you have the foliage and you have the deep mud, it seems to me that that is something that we can imagine all too well. And I use this slide not only because we're on the brink of the Lunar New Year of the ox, but because I have no illusions that creating the sort of narrative that I previewed tonight will be an easy task. No road is made without trudging in the mud. But with so many resources to draw upon and building upon the passion of so many people who are part of this webinar and part of the larger interreligious realm, I believe it's a worthwhile and necessary endeavor. So just a few closing reflections. Inevitably, this equilibrium and vulnerability are part of the process of reorientation. It is not unusual to encounter resistance to a more complex narrative, especially one that involves facing a difficult history. And what a challenge it is to offer complexity in an age of alternative facts and involvement in conspiracy theories. I recently pulled off my shelf a book from the 1980s entitled, "What Prevents Christian Adults from Learning?" I especially am taking note of the chapter, "The Need to Be Right and the Pain of Learning." So this project needs to be characterized by a careful vision, clarity and transparency about methodology, especially with regard to interpreting biblical texts. We don't necessarily need to we should not get into using the kind of elite terminology that scholars use, but we need to explain why we can make this claim about what this biblical text can mean. This needs to be done with time for interaction, time for reflection and absorption. If we want to reorient people, we need to give them time to let that take root. And it also needs to be connected with the life of faith, with implications for living faith. For much of our history, we Christians have been on a quest to erase religious diversity via conversion, conquest, colonization. In his new book, Circling the Elephant, my Union colleague John Tatamanil invites us to imagine a God who seeks to be known in, through, and by way of difference. Perhaps, he says, the practices and insights of the other can become sacraments for our way into divine life. Interreligious work is holy labor. It is this vision that sustains the work of wayfaring, of making a road while walking. Please join me in being a wayfarer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And the part of me that yearns to be walking a trail in the mountains also to take these thoughts with me in the path along the way. And it's really very, very powerful. The chat is open for questions, and please feel free to submit them. We have a few, but we will really welcome many more, and anything we don't get to, we will share with Mary in writing, and we can also supply her with your email address. So a question from a friend of yours, a good friend of yours, Phil Cunningham. We'll begin with that. And he starts
We'll
off.
see what good of a friend he is, depending on the question.
Yes, well, for those of you who don't know, have never seen Mary and Phil Cunningham together, teasing each other is part of the dynamic. But he really began saying, "Hi, Mary." And then he has a serious, important question. He said, regarding Barbara Meyer's book, in addition to the quote that you cited, I was quite taken by her comment that Jesus the Jew remains an other for contemporary Christians with regard to his embodiment of Torah and bodily practices of the commandments. His otherness thus increases with an intensified memory of his Jewishness. And he says, any thoughts? Do you agree with this portrayal? And if so, how should Christians best approach this dialectic, theologically, spiritually?
Well, this will disappoint Phil, but I do agree with him in this. And it's one of the aspects of Barbara's book that has stayed with me the longest, because she talks about that those of us who are followers of Jesus but not Jewish necessarily relate to him as other. I don't know what that means yet. I mean, it's one of those concepts that instinctively, I think is right. But I think it's something that I need to ponder a great deal. I think maybe what she's, that at the same time that getting into deeper knowledge of who the Jewish Jesus is will seem to bring him closer, which I think is true. We also have this sort of distancing, and maybe it's a way of not thinking that we know Jesus entirely, of letting ourselves be open to keep learning what that way of life means for us.
Okay. Let's turn to a question from Lawrence Edwards. He comments the notion of Jews before Judaism would also be enlightening for lots of Jews. So maybe we can expand that. Based on your experience in Christian-Jewish relations, what do you think Christians can uniquely offer to Jewish scholars, not just learning from Jewish scholars about common Judaism?
Well, I think it's helpful to both our traditions to see that the relationship that we associate with the adversarial connection is not the only way we can understand who we are, and even in some of the more difficult parts of our history, that it was that very contestation that shaped us. I think a book that I found quite useful is Yuval's book, Two Nations in Her Womb, that that Judaism became, in a sense, thought of as a religion, in part as the reverse mirror image of Christianity. And understanding, so that one of the things that I've come to recognize in the past couple of years, that second through fourth, fifth century is a very important time for both of our communities. And if we could understand with a little more nuance and more knowledge about that area, I think it would help us to see, for me, the insight that that at the same time, the early church writers were trying to make the connections to the scriptures of Israel, and yet they're very disconnect from the Jewish ethnos, shaped their reading. Helps me in a sense to redeem their work and also to critique it. And for the most part, I think my own work has been more in the area of New Testament, and I'm thinking that, and the other thing that I think would be helpful, and this is where I think we need Jews for this whole project. I mean, this is not something that, we need the collaboration, but I think we need to understand the differing modes of argumentation. And it's hard, I think, for most Christians to get into the mode of argumentation that characterizes rabbinic thinking, and to understand that rabbinic thinking evolved and that the rabbis just didn't, to understand what was going on in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries and so forth. So Rabbi Edwards, we did a workshop together many years ago. So it's a pleasure to hear from you.
I'm going to jump to a question that just came in from Marianne Hinsdale, who is a colleague of yours in many ways, and a colleague of ours here at Boston College in the theology department. Said, just today, a student who identifies as spiritual, not religious, who was raised Christian, said that he didn't know anything about Jesus and didn't need to, since he was simply about loving your neighbor, and it should just remain abstract. Is there any advice about how to respond to this? And then she also comments, of course, in our next unit of the course, we're going to be dealing with Jesus as a Jew, and read Pagola's Jesus and Historical Approximation. But
well, I'd say about myself, I'm spiritual, but not pious. So I think one of the things would be to point out that love in community, whatever community you're in, is very difficult work. And so that's why religious communities necessarily develop norms, necessarily develop policies. And so, it's fine just to say, I belong to a community. You live with other people, you rub up against each other, fine, say you love me, but take the garbage out when the time comes. I mean, and this is one of the things that I think, because what the rabbis were trying to do, and earlier religious leaders, what are they arguing about? They're arguing about practices. Is this life-giving covenantal life? Why not? Or why? And I think if we think of human communities trying to love, we need to do that within some strictures. I'm not sure that would be the greatest answer I could give to this person, but Marianne, go to it.
Okay, another very broad question in some ways, but we'll try to narrow it down some. So Oberek Stanislaw asks, can you tell me how American Catholicism changed after Vatican II? And so maybe we can think, well, what is it that the church, where does the church need to go most doctrinally and ecclesially? What if there were a Vatican III coming up soon? And related to this, from Amy Jill Levine, speaking as a Bible scholar, who thanks you for the lecture, I've heard there's going to be an update to the official Catholic translation of the Bible, the NABRE, pretty soon. And is there any new, is this correct news? And if so, are any Jews involved in the production of it? And especially she's concerned about the notes.
I'll answer in reverse order because I don't know anything really developing on the horizon about the new Bible translation. So I just simply don't know. On the question from Stan Obirek in Poland, I would say that we've gone through several eras of the post-Vatican II church in the United States. I would say that the first era, I mean, in all cases, it's been contentious. But from my perspective, immediately after the council, or not immediately, this is the next day, but in the, say, the 10 years after the council, there was a tremendous emphasis, not only on the liturgical changes and so forth, but on biblical interpretation. And great biblical scholars went across the country giving lectures, and I was in college and in my early years of teaching during this time, and it was so exciting. And the bishops were going to these sessions. I mean, they were learning things anew as well. And now I think, sadly, in the American Catholic Church, the bishops have gotten involved more in sort of cultural issues, sort of pro-life issues, but kind of a narrow perspective on it, in my view. And there's not much attention. I'd love it if we had a real thrust from the bishops' conference, or even from one or two bishops, to say countering anti-Semitism is the work of a just Catholic Church. It's fine to make a statement here and then, but I don't see any stimuli coming from the bishops about this matter. And so I guess we can't wait. We need to do it ourselves. But it would be a tremendous help if a couple of bishops would see this as a priority, and see adult education as a priority.
In many ways, we could add that the sex abuse crisis in the church sort of threw everything into that direction.
Yes.
In now over 20 years ago. And it's been hard to get the energy back.
And sadly, that means a very mixed legacy for Pope John Paul, because he really did not so seriously confront that problem in the church. And so, and it still remains a huge problem. And it's, as you say, it absorbed not only a lot of energy and a lot of money, but it's meant that things like educational programs have a hard time finding funding, which is why schools like Boston College, St. Joseph's in Philadelphia, to give a shout out to Phil Cunningham, and all these other wonderful institutes are so important.
Great. We have a pair of questions, but I'm going to give them to you one at a time because I think they can get
that's good.
Here. This is from Teresa O'Keefe, who in some ways fills some of your shoes that you left empty here at Boston College when you moved to New York. And she says, I'm increasingly aware of how challenges to Christian or Catholic identity are always perceived as loss. And so many Christians would find this reconfiguring distressing before anything else. Can you identify up front something about Christian identity rethought that is augmented or clearly valuable and additive?
Well, I think the discovery of of the beauty of another religious tradition is one of the most important gifts that we can receive. It gives us a whole new understanding of ourselves, particularly the Christian Jewish one, because of our long history and some mutual origins, but really of all other religious traditions. And it enables us to live with a little less, I think, anxiety that, to think of the religious other as somehow dangerous to our identity. I like the Boyarin term of reciprocally settled identities. I think he gets at, we figured out who we are, and we've figured out who you are. And when new knowledge breaks in, it's unsettling. And I think a lot of the anger in the United States today is because our settled identities are being shaken. And so, yes, I think she's right. And that's why I talked about vulnerability and resistance. But at least in my own years of teaching, I think if we allow people some time to absorb this and to talk with one another, I'm a great believer in conversation about these matters. That we can't just deliver these things as a lecture. We need to work back and forth. And I also would speak to the importance of interreligious friendship. It's a term that I associate with James Fredericks. And as long as I'm on the topic of interreligious friendship, I just like to give a shout out to my dear friend Sarah Lee, who is watching tonight, retired from Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and now living in the greater Boston area.
And welcome from us too, Sarah. A question from Julia McStrava. This was the other half of the pair of questions from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. How do you envision passing these ideas of Jewish-Christian relationship, of community, walking together, building together, learning together, to younger people who might assume that the Jewish-Christian relationship is all great and does not need more attention?
Well, we had some pretty powerful counter symbols in the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. The Christian nationalists, the mob praying in the name of Jesus Christ in the Senate gallery, the incredible violence, the sweatshirt that says Camp Auschwitz and on the back says staff. I think that one way in for younger people would be to study the whole phenomenon of white nationalism and Christian nationalism, because it's not limited to young people, but I was disturbed by how many young people were at the Capitol. And I do want to say that I'm not related to the Proud Boys.
Nobody was accusing you of that. I should give a little bit of a plug to a lecture that actually my husband, Jonathan Sarna, gave for us yes. on January 13th, talking about the anti-Semitism involved in the white nationalist movements in America right now, spurred by the Capitol events, but really looking back before them as well. And that's on the center's website, in addition to everything else.
And I would add to that, and I think Jonathan mentions conspiracy theories as part of that lecture. And that's another thing, Julia, that I think that conspiracy theories are almost always racist and anti-Semitic.
Yeah, let's take one more question. There's several more really good ones here, but maybe we can formally close and other people can join in, can stay on if they want for a few more questions. But a question from Emma Martin, which is the name of a student in my class right now. I don't know whether she's that Emma Martin or not. But she says, what role do you think pop culture has in further complicating the Jewish-Christian relations and contributing to some of the anti-Semitism in our world today? For example, the movie The Passion of the Christ made $612 million in the box office and was seen by millions, but I don't believe I even know of a single movie that depicts Jesus as a Jew.
Well, I don't know anything about pop culture, I will be honest. I do know a lot, or I did know a lot about Mel Gibson in that film. Ruth and I were involved with many programs around that one. And I'm thinking of the film Jesus of Montreal. I haven't seen it for a long time. I need to look at it again in terms of how much his Jewishness is emphasized. But I think that that's a film that might be brought back. Adela Reinhartz has done more work on, she has a book, I think, called Jesus of Hollywood. Is that right, Ruth? So that's where I would go for a source. I think she's been the one who's done more of the work in terms of pop culture and cultural issues more generally. So it's a great question. I'm not qualified to give a great answer.
It strikes me, though, it's a question that really points to a direction that would be powerful for incorporation into your book, the direction you're going. So,
well, yeah. And the other thing, just as long as we're on the art question, is that one of the ways to understand what the problems between Christians and Jews is Sarah Lipton's book called The Distant Mirror, which she has, she's an art historian, and many things available on the web, her images. And they're powerful. That she concentrates on the Middle Ages when this anti-Jewish art is at its peak. But how do we portray a Jewish Jesus today? To what extent that we show him with the talit, or with the, we don't have any idea what the home at Nazareth looked like, but it probably had a mezuzah. I mean, so that, how we depict things, how we portray things is very important.
Yeah. So we are now past our time, but do you want to take a few more questions, or should we call it a night?
It's up to you. I'm happy to stay for a few minutes. I realize people have other commitments, or maybe another Zoom meeting.
Or dinner, for those of us on the East Coast.
Yes.
A question from Francis Agnoli. He asks, what is happening at the level of seminaries when it comes to awakening this kind of awareness and informing the preaching of soon-to-be priests? I've seen little evidence from the AMBO that this is taken seriously. In fact, quite the opposite, especially with the rise of more traditionalist or integralist worldviews.
That's exactly how I see it. Now, meaning Catholic seminaries. I think that there's more, and I certainly don't know. I'm not speaking. For instance, Catholic Theological Union in Chicago would be an example of a seminary where this is really a very important dimension of life. But now, I don't know every diocesan seminary, but I will say that in the last decade, I've been scandalized by the lack of attention to this. I'm not sure if you asked younger priests, by which I mean under 40, what is Nostra Aetate? What significance does it have? I think they'd have a hard time doing more than writing a simple sentence. It's very discouraging. And again, I think the bishops are not giving enough direction to this. And also, frankly, in an earlier period, there was so much fear about doctrinal adherence that people were really afraid, I think, to teach outside kind of a sort of limited boundaries. So, but again, I think certainly Catholic universities and colleges do a great job by and large. And I think, the question is, to what extent a place like your center can partner with St. John's Seminary across the way to help in the education of priests. But I don't think that the seminarians see this as a priority. Yeah.
And of course, it's not just the St. John's Seminary across the way, but we're training priests in our School of Theology and Ministry also.
Right.
So yes.
Thanks be to God.
I think that the rest of the questions get very complicated and it's late for everybody. Right. So I think we will call it a night and say thank you so much, Mary, for really a bringing together so many different threads of things that I speak and teach about, but in a way that's comprehensive, approachable, and seeks to be even more approachable, so that this work that we're engaged in will have maximum impact. And so I really look forward to your book. If Mary's email was put in the chat at some point, if people want to follow up with her in person about anything. And we also will have the recording available shortly. It will take a little while to process it, but it will be available so that you can recommend it to friends next week and after that too. So thank you very, very much. And we look forward to a deferred dinner to sit down and have a conversation about all this.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for asking me. And I'm wondering whether some of the messages and questions are in the chat or in your Google Doc you could send to me so that I could keep thinking about them.
We'll send you all. We'll also send you a list of the participants who came.
Excellent. So thank you all. Thank you.